Hello, everyone. Hi, Brigid, again. Welcome to this event where we are delighted to be having a conversation with Brigid Schulte. Brigid is a renowned journalist, author, and writer. She's known for one of her best-selling books, Overwhelmed: Work, Love, and Play When No One Has the Time, and most recently, Overwork, which is a book that we will be talking about today. Bridget does a wonderful job in bringing together data and people's stories in a way that highlights a lot of the things that we've got wrong about work. So we'll be spending some time discussing that. And we will also be talking about examples of best practice around the world that enable and empower a lot of the workers and organizations they work in to overcome that feeling of overwork. So welcome, Bridget. Thank you very much for being here with us. We are recording the webinar and we will be sharing it with our community later. First and foremost, can you please tell us about why you decided to write the book and why on overwork?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's really wonderful to be in community with all of you. I'm really looking forward to a robust discussion. I'm a reporter, so I always love hearing from people and their stories. I'm always learning. So thank you so much for inviting me to this conversation in your community. So the question, like why I wrote the book, I have to be very honest. When I finished my first book, Overwhelmed: Work, Love, and Play When No One Has the Time, that was very much a book that sprang from my own experience. I had two young children. I was working at the Washington Post full time as a reporter, and I just felt like I was falling apart at the seams. I felt like, oh my God, am I the only one that can't seem to manage how to do, really, I wanted to do a good job. It really meant a lot to me to be a reporter is a big part of, and a writer is a big part of my identity. It's part of how I sort of see my role in my life, my lifetime to share stories, to help us understand our lives and each other, and to, hopefully introduce ideas that can help all of us live better lives. I mean, so that was a very important part of my identity. But being a mother, really present for my kids was a huge part of my identity. And, it was like I saw how my father worked sort of all the time, and I was trying to work like him. And I saw how my mother, she was an at-home mom, like, like a lot of women were in the 60s and 70s. And so, I thought I should parent like her. Well, that's two lives in one, and you just can't do that. And yet nobody was really talking about it in a meaningful way. I'm sort of still talking about the first book. And so that book was a whole exploration, a journey of trying to understand, well, why is there this feeling of time pressure, especially for women? And what can we do about it? Is there anything real? Beyond the like I wrote a magazine story for the Washington Post, and I got all of these emails about like, oh, just breathe deeply at red traffic lights, or take a bath, you baby, like just suck it up kind of. And I just thought that was so inadequate. And I was feeling inadequate. And when I wrote a magazine story, I think what made me decide to go, really, I'm still on the same journey. What made me decide to go on this journey is that I got a stack of emails from people. I printed them out in the old days. It was like this high. And it wasn't just from women, it was from men and people with caregiving responsibilities without them. And all of them said, you climbed into my head and you wrote about my life. And then I thought, all right, well, what is it that's driving this kind of overwhelm that so many people feel like you just don't have enough time in your day, in your week, in your life to do the things that you both need and want to do. So that was the journey of Overwhelmed. And when I finished that book, where I really looked at time and gender, kind of time pressure and gender, and, kind of the three great arenas that make for a good life: work and love and play, leisure time. At the end of that writing that book, I knew that particularly in the United States, what drives so much of that overwhelm, and if we're ever really going to attack it in a meaningful way that will affect a lot of people, it centers on work, the way we think about our work, the way we do our work, the way that what we value in our work and how we reward people. So I actually began reporting this book the very day that Overwhelmed was done. So I began reporting this book in 2013. And I've been working on it for quite some time. I left the Washington Post in the meanwhile, and I came to New America, which is a nonpartisan think tank. And I began to direct the program, the sort of, it had been the work family program. And I really wanted to explore these much bigger themes about not, you know, these larger systems, but also how we operate in them and how they shape our lives and the way we think. And so we began really, I would say for the last 10 years and continuing on, I'm really trying to do research, reporting, and writing at the intersection of personal transformation because we all want that. We all want to feel like we're living a good life. This is our one and only lives, but also putting that into a larger perspective because sometimes we can't do it all by ourselves. And so, how do we work at the intersection of personal transformation and systems change? So, that's really what this book explores very deeply at work what's not working and what could work and how.
Mm. Yeah, and I think it's very timely, and that intersection is so important because, on one hand, for about a decade, we've had the lean in narrative that was putting it on women to fix the system and succeed at work, and equally feeling the pressure of doing housework and taking care of the children. Also, women do a lot of the community work and civic engagement work as well, that is volunteering in our community. So, juggling all those things seemed like an overwhelming system that is just bulldozing over women's lives, and also as kind of a narrative that is asking of women to come and step in and create that change. So you've spent about 10 years writing the book, and it got published in 24, and it feels like it's been 10 years since 2024.
It's
Um, what would you say has, if anything, changed over the past couple of years since the book came out?
So I have to be really honest with you. I think the book came out at a really unfortunate time. You know, we were really hoping to ride this kind of wave of experimentation and innovation and trying new things that really was forced upon people during the COVID pandemic. Overnight, you had businesses who said we could never do it any different way, all of a sudden forced to figure out how to work differently. We had hourly workers who had been for so long invisible and undervalued. All of a sudden, they were getting hero pay and we were clapping for them. They became very visible. We could see how critical it was to have somebody from DoorDash come and give you your food when you couldn't go out to the grocery store and buy it yourself. And we began to hear more of their stories that they weren't earning a living wage. And so they were working overtime in about three or four different jobs and side hustles. And was that really fair? So we were sort of at this really interesting cusp of changing work in a variety of ways, not just for knowledge workers, where, there was much more flexibility in when, where, and how you worked in a way that really worked for people. I spoke with a number of men who had been sort of caught up in this ideal worker, always on kind of culture that we have, particularly here in the United States, where the longer you work and the later you work, somehow that's a badge of honor, the better worker you are, which has always disadvantaged people with care responsibilities, always disadvantaged women. But it's also disadvantaged men. And so during the pandemic, I talked to so many men who said, "Oh my God, I know now that I know what it's like to be home for dinner, or now that I know what it's like to walk my daughter to kindergarten, I don't want to go back. I'm just as productive. I'm actually more innovative and efficient, and I have time for my life. I want to keep doing this." And then you had so many more women. I mean, what was interesting, you had a lot of women forced out of the workforce initially. But then over time, you saw this incredible spring back, particularly among women who could work like at a desk because there was flexibility that, you could work a hybrid schedule or a remote, or I like to call it a digital schedule. And so the statistics showed that women, particularly mothers of young children, they roared back into the workplace. So we were at this real cusp of like, wow, things could really be different. And then when my book came out, that's what I was hoping to kind of lead those conversations or be part of those burgeoning conversations. And instead, we really got caught up in the 2024 presidential election, which was incredibly divisive. Lots of fear, lots of anger, lots of I've never seen the United States so polarized before. And then, really, since Trump has been elected, almost immediately his first executive orders were like, no more diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's somehow woke. So out the window with that, with executive orders. All of a sudden, return to office. It didn't really matter that if you had to come back to a closet or there was no place for you to go, or it didn't matter that you were actually incredibly productive and innovative where you were. So sort of like this snap back to old ways of thinking, old ways of doing things. And so I think the conversation that I was hoping we would have really got stifled. And that's why I'm so excited to come to a place like this, because even if it's small, we need to keep having these conversations because change is coming. And what I don't want to see is sort of this really terrifying AI inflected, future where AI is doing all of the work and then people don't have the jobs, like we see all the young college educated folks having a really difficult time getting into the workforce, and people being automated out of jobs. Then what? So I don't want to see that future. And I think the time will always be ripe to have the discussion of how can we really make this better in a way that works for businesses? Because I mean, that's a huge part of the equation. And in the United States, business really, really matters because we don't have a lot of the policies that many other, say, European countries do. So, what can we do that will benefit business, but will also benefit people and their families and their communities and society in the future? So I'm glad we're having this conversation because they did go underground, and I'm really hoping that we can keep them going underground, and then there will come a time that it will burst open again. But it's a long way of saying, um, I think things are interesting and changing on the ground, but the narrative and the story that we're talking about has sort of been taken over by the Trump administration and kind of this, what feels like a regressive return to pre-2019. But if you really look underneath the data, there's still a lot of innovation happening, and there's still a lot of really hopeful things going on. And that's part of what I'm trying to do is kind of keep trying to show a spotlight on that. It's like, do not give up hope that the sort of the larger narrative might be changing, but the truth on the ground is really what's interesting, and that's what to keep looking at.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know you talk about the US landscape, how it's different from the European landscape, but at the same time, a lot of this culture has been spilling into the UK, for instance, through the tech sector and the tech startup ecosystem, where a lot of this work is actually glamorized and is that badge of honor that a lot of the founders in the tech ecosystem or the leaders of the tech startup ecosystem are spotlighting and highlighting through different platforms as something that is as something that they take pride in. So it is a wave that is spilling over into Europe as well. Now, what we're going to do is I have a few more questions about the book for you, but I'd like to encourage anyone in the audience to think about questions of yourselves that you'll get a chance to ask Brigid towards the end. And before we delve more into the content, I just wanted to talk about the storytelling element of it, because it's something that really, I've been working in the data space, data and the future of work, data and the gender pay gap for a very long time, and kind of I've been very data focused in everything that I did, and I felt like I have to have data points for every single issue that I was talking about. And yet, in your book, it is the stories of people that really caught my attention more so than the data itself. So what did you pick on where to introduce stories and what stories to introduce? And just maybe you could tell us a bit more about this storytelling part of your book.
Sure. So let me just say first off, I love data, and I think it's really, really important. I think it adds, kind of a spine to a story. I think it adds gravitas to an argument. So I think data is really important. But the more I reported the story, sort of like, well, I was sort of lost. I'm like, I don't know what this book is. I'll just keep talking to people. I'll just keep reporting. And I just kept going. And the more I kept going and the more I talked to people, there were certain patterns that emerged that were really, frankly, to me, were surprising. And that was, when I was looking at work redesigns and some really innovative things that different companies had done. And I'm thinking of the results only work environment that, say, Best Buy pioneered, and really fascinating and important research, like very rigorous blind controlled trials. I mean, the highest standard of social science. Research that went on and showed so much benefit for this different way of working that benefited the company as well as, it gave people more time for their lives and spent time with their children, and they slept better and they were healthier. There were all these cascading benefits. I'm thinking about another work redesign. My friend and mentor, Joan Williams, she ran with the Gap companies, along with some other really great researchers, looking at, well, what happens when you give retail workers schedule control, more control over their schedule? Because a lot of people may not realize, but one of the misuses of algorithms and AI has been really being played out in the retail and sort of the hourly wage workforce. You've got these companies where their goal is to reduce labor so much, because their margins are so small. They want to like completely reduce labor to try to maximize their profits. But then in using these scheduling software, it's not programmed well. And then you end up treating people like widgets. And so I would talk to people who would, arrange for childcare and then get on the bus and take three different buses to get to work on time, only to be told, well, go back, go home because now it's raining and we don't think people are coming. So they're out time and money. And it was just wreaking havoc. Sort of people's time has just been really chaotic and unpredictable. And so they were able to show that when you give workers more predictability, sales actually increased. Morale went up, turnover went down. So it was, again, good for people and good for business. So again, as I was looking through the data on, some of the best research on work redesign, I saw that over and over and over again, really great experiments, great outcomes, amazing data that proved it. And then a new leader would come in or something would change and overnight it'd be gone. And I began to realize how powerful leadership mindset is. And what a leader chooses to believe is so much more powerful than any you could give them. We would give these leaders. I was part of a really interesting experiment with Ideas 42, looking at using behavioral science techniques to try to move overwork culture. And when you have a leader who says, yeah, that's all really nice, work-life balance, that's for other people. We really care about our jobs. We really care about our work. So we're working all the time. If you've got a leader with a closed mind and their belief is that overwork is the only way to do excellent work, and their belief is that you can't possibly have a family and rise, or that you can't possibly treat your workers well and make money. If you believe that, you're going to create that culture. And so that's, I think, why I leaned into both data, but mainly stories, and tried to show the stories of some of the leaders who shifted their mindsets. Some of it through exposure therapy almost. I think COVID really opened the eyes of a lot of people, which is why I'm sort of sad that many of them have sort of lost their courage and backbone. It's sort of like the general story seems to be snapped back to 2019, but many of them have not, and they're kind of smaller, quieter stories. And they to me are the real heroes because a lot of leaders, they don't talk sort of vertically. They talk to their own sort of CEO circles. And many of them are men. Many of them either have no care responsibilities themselves or they have somebody else taking care of them. They can either pay for it or they have an at-home person or a partner that like maybe has a more flexibility in their schedule. So they talk to each other and they have the same life experience, which is not what most people have. And so the leaders that get out of that echo chamber and really listen, really understand what people are going through, and then listen. And what I saw from some of the most successful COVID redesigns is turning it over to the people closest to the work and getting really clear on like, well, what is the work? How do we create value? And how do we organize systems to prioritize that, celebrate that, reward that, measure that, rather than, oh, you're here late, you must be doing a good job. Because those are really old metrics. That's like factory metrics. Um, uh, so I think that's why I leaned into story so much is trying to help I don't know, help the scales fall from people's eyes. That just because you something worked for you in your life doesn't mean it's the only or the best way to do things.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in the UK we have the concept of having a high-vis jacket on the chair. So if your jacket is on the chair, it means you're present somewhere. So that kind of presenteeism associated with productivity is very much also there. You've mentioned the retail workforce, and you do cover that in the book, but you also cover health workers, and I'd like to talk about that a bit more. And you talk about burned out health professionals like canaries in a coal mine. What we don't need is stronger
Mm,
canaries. We need a new coal mine. So can you talk us through some
yeah.
examples of what that would look like?
Yeah. So in each of the chapters, I wanted people to have an experience of like going deeply into what the challenge is and then really focus on the change agents, people who are trying to push back against the system. And so you're kind of like rooting for an underdog. But then at the end of every chapter, show a bright spot of somebody that's one of these change agents. Some of them are, are still out there and not getting traction, but many of them are, and really trying at the end of every chapter, or some of them are entire chapters of people doing things that are really different and very cool. A venture, somebody who does private equity, who will only invest in companies that create good jobs. I mean, you don't hear that story. That's pretty cool. And so with burned out workers, particularly health workers, I mean, the statistics are really devastating. Uh, Doctors, nurses, people in the health professions, they are overworked. Long hours are sort of the price of admission. It definitely has this, starting at, with residency, think of all of the time, that you see it in the hospital shows. Like, a poor resident has been on for like 2 days straight and is napping on an ER cot somewhere. We expect people to make life and death decisions when they're completely exhausted and burned out. And yet it's sort of like this badge of honor, kind of like a hazing ritual. We're going to, make sure that you can go through this. Can you really hack it? I've talked to a number of people in the medical profession who say a lot of American corporate culture is sort of this ideal worker. And they're like, we have an Iron Man culture. You got to be Iron Man, be able to compete in an Iron Man and then also be as like a superhero like Iron Man and just act as if you are superhuman and don't need to rest. They call like when they have to do their paperwork, the nickname for it is pajama time because there's no time during your shift to do it. So they'll do it late at night, sitting in their pajamas. It's almost like a joke. Well, they have no time for life, for recovery, for rest. And so burnout rates are incredibly high. Doctor stress and exhaustion is associated with making really bad decisions, bad mistakes, and these are life and death decisions. You've got high suicide rates, so it's a real problem, and we know it. We talk about it a lot, and you've got some people. I call it almost like the lunchtime yoga. It's like, oh, well, we'll give you a meditation app. It's sort of like the advice I was given. Oh, take a bath, just calm down. And what I was really trying to do is show that a lot of that overwork is a result of larger systems decisions, understaffing, prioritizing profits over, the well-being of your workers, even though you would make a fairly substantial profit if you prioritize the well-being of your workers. So one of the people that I focused on as a sort of a change agent, his one of his family members was a physician, totally dedicated to her job, but ended up having a breakdown, needed some mental health treatment, and then was so afraid that she'd be stigmatized for having sought mental health treatment. She was so afraid that they would take her license away and she wouldn't be able to practice medicine because it is stigmatized in the medical profession that you're not an Iron Man, that you somehow can't hack it if you have a burnout session or or you just need time off or a mental health break. So she actually ended up taking her own life. And the family was just galvanized and devastated by that, but then galvanized to really take on the system. It's like, this has got to be more than lunchtime yoga. And so they're actively working with states and licensing boards to remove the stigma, to make it okay for doctors to seek mental health treatment when they need it. I mean, how can you prescribe it for someone else, but then be, punished if you seek it out for yourself? They're really trying to work on how to make electronic records and paperwork, how to reduce that administrative burden, how to be smarter about that so you don't have pajama time, so you can give people their time back. They're having the conversations about how important it is to have right staffing, not to be so profit oriented and understaffed, which is really difficult in our system to do that. But they're having some successes, and that's really exciting to see.
Very important conversations, and you've mentioned this briefly now, but there's also an important conversation to be had about impact of overwork on health and people's health. And one of the data points in your book that was staggering to me is the 120,000 people, the excess deaths a year from overwork. That to me is a number that stayed with me. So can you talk a bit about that as well?
So it's so interesting. When I was younger, I lived in Japan. As an English teacher right out of college, and so I saw the overwork culture there. And it's sort of, Japan is sort of famous for having this word they called karoshi, or death from overwork. And so when I began reporting this book, I thought, well, I should go to Japan and really try to understand what drives it there. And so I began really researching the links between overwork and health and, kind of what drives overwork and the karoshi culture. And I was thinking it was going to be really different, that somehow, and you do have like American writers who talk about, well, it's the samurai spirit. It's so unique to Japan. And I think what surprised me the most is that it's not unique to Japan. It has absolutely nothing to do with exotic samurai culture. It has everything to do with the way you set up your system. It has everything to do with what you value. And so, when in the United States, like in Japan, you have corporations who value what their short-term earnings look like on Wall Street and not what the workers are experiencing, you are going to have systems that will drive overwork, that will try to squeeze every last bit of labor out of you. But I also saw, like in Japan, a lot of what drives overwork is culture, inefficiency, and ambiguity. A lot of times work jobs are not well defined, so people don't know when they're done for the day. And the culture is such that you can't leave till your boss leaves. So I was talking to one guy, he was at his office at 11 at night, and thought he was going to be there for several hours more, and that was typical. And I was like, well, what are you doing? He goes, I have nothing to do, so I'm just making blank Xerox copies so my boss will think I'm busy. So that's what drives a lot of overwork is what I ended up calling stupid work. And I think what really shocked me is how much that is also present in the United States, that we have these cultures that value overwork, long work hours, work-life conflict, high, when we think of like the layoffs are just have become a normal cycle of the business cycle, but unemployment is incredibly stressful for people. The uncertainty that creates. And so I ended up finding a lot of research based here in the United States about how work stress actually leads to both acute illness, you'll have a stroke in the moment or, a heart attack after, working nonstop for several days. But it also can lead to chronic illness over time. If you are exhausted and working hard, day after day after day, you come home, you don't feel like making a healthy meal. You don't have the energy to go to the gym. And so there's been all sorts of research that links overwork to depression, obesity, cardiovascular disease, inflammation, even cancer. And so I ended up calling my chapter American Karoshi because we have the same culture here. The difference is in Japan, the change agents I followed were all these victim families who are, they've lost a loved one, either, through Karoshi, or through, they call it, it's another word, but sort of, you become so overworked, you take your own life. You just become so depressed, you can't take it anymore. And there's a rising depression. And it's interesting, it used to be thought of as like that they call it the salary man, sort of the male's disease. But teachers have really high rates of karoshi and depression, along with truck drivers, so surprising industries. The difference is those families really lobbied the government. They sued companies. They created a big stink. They continue to do so. They're so dedicated. I saw them sitting in the Japanese Diet, sort of the Congress there, And when they've got a bill on work hours, they all are up there sort of like these silent avenging angels with these enormous photos of their loved ones who have died from karoshi. So they've created a public awareness and they've changed the law. They now require the government to track these statistics. They've got like caps on work hours where now there's all sorts of crazy workarounds, so the companies can still continue to like push people. But we don't have any of that in the United States. So it's happening here, but we don't know about it because we don't track it and we don't talk about it. And, the way our disability laws work is that you would, you would have to literally fall down like in your office to be able to prove that your work was what created your heart attack. So we make it really difficult to track here. So that's just a long way of saying, the World Health Organization has recognized how work stress is an enormous problem and that, work burnout is an occupational phenomenon that we should all care about. But you don't hear a lot of conversation about that in the United States, largely because of this culture where we valorize that kind of work and we think, oh, they're amazing. They're working so hard. They're so dedicated. They lost their lives. Isn't that great?
Tech is coming in as a big solution or is being presented as a big solution to this. AI is being presented as a solution to the overwork, where we are meant to think we're going to live in a world where we have more time to ourselves and for our lives. And yet, most recent reports are showing that a lot of the people in the tech space are actually ending up working significantly longer hours right now than they did before, with all of the AI tools that we have available at hand. So this kind of tech solution versus what is actually happening in place, how do you see that? How have you seen that play out?
It's such a great question, and it's such an important one, because it shows you the power, again, of story, of belief, the power of narrative, the power that narrative has to shape our cultures. Because if you introduce AI in an overwork, ideal worker, karoshi, Iron Man culture, where layoffs are common and you reward people who work really late, all you are going to do is this tool is going to be used to rev that up. And that's one of my concerns. I think a lot of people who are talking about AI, none of us know what we're talking about. So, I think it is a brave new world that could go a lot of different ways. But one of the things that I am worried about that I do not think we're talking about enough is how our cultures could actually make it worse. Because again, if you think that the best workers work all the time, the ideal worker has no life. I mean, whether you've got caregiving or not, the idea is that you are work devoted. Work comes first no matter what. In that instance, and say maybe you've got regular layoffs. So on the one hand, you've got workers who are doing more and more work because there are fewer and fewer workers. And maybe AI can help with that, but your workload is too much. So that's one stress that's happening. And then again, if you've got that culture that rewards long work hours, AI is just going to, instead of it'll make you more efficient, but then the expectation is that you're going to do more. And I do worry, because again, through these work redesigns, we've got excellent data, excellent stories, excellent research about how when you do work effectively, work gets better and your life gets better. And we're not paying attention to that. So then you throw AI in the mix. I worry that that could ratchet things up.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So if we want, like, let's turn our attention to more of that positive impact and positive stories that are happening around the world and things people can take away that they can do in their own professional lives. What are you seeing as most progressive practices in this space?
So, in the back of my book, just because going back to the whole idea that if you only write about systems change, that tends to depress people. It feels too big. Oh, what can I do? Oh my God, that's too much. And so, what I try to do is sort of shrink the change. So, what can you do on your personal level? The appendix, I had to let it narrow it down. It's like, oh, here are 10 things that you can do. And 10 things you can do on the organizational level, whether you're a leader, a team leader, or you just even have a couple people that report to you. There's a lot that you can do. And then what can we do together? Like, let's put our oxygen masks on, and then what can we do together to change and work toward those larger systems changes, those culture changes? And the thing is, change is funny. And that's why I'm really hopeful. I mean, it's sort of like it takes years and years and years, and then it seems like it happens overnight, which is why conversations like this and keeping these kinds of conversations alive is so important because it keeps the pressure on for change in a positive direction. But I found a lot of hopeful stories all around the world, even here in the United States, in like going back to Japan and this overwork culture. So you've got the victim families fighting for a different way of working. You've got a lot of young men who want to be, who want a life outside of work. Some of them are fathers. Some of them just want to like be able to like go for a walk and not have to work until 11 o'clock at night making Xerox copies. So you've got young men really involved, young women as well who are like, this is not the life I want. Um, so you've kind of got the bottom up movements, which is really exciting. When I was spent time in Iceland, and I know the United States and a lot of countries are not Iceland, but what was so interesting and why I went there is that they made shorter work hours possible for 85% of the workforce. And how did they do that? And in a fairly short period of time. And what they were able to do is they ran pilots and they had businesses really interested. So they kind of brought people together. They sort of talked about like, why are we doing this? What is it that we really want? And they wanted more, innovation and productivity. They knew that they needed well-rested workers to be able to do that. They were really prioritizing well-being as an economic indicator of a country's success, not just GDP or how the stock market is doing as a measure of a nation's success, but like how happy and healthy are people? It's like, what a concept, what a great idea. That your purpose is to really ensure a quality of life for your people. So that was a goal, and gender equality was a real goal. And I remember talking to one of the architects, and she said, we were so worried. We thought that, oh, the men, if they worked shorter hours, they'd just go to the gym. But they didn't. I mean, obviously they did, but so did women. I talked to a lot of women who like started to swim more. They had more time for themselves and also their families if they had them or wanted to. And I spoke with some of the most surprising people, childcare workers who were able to work a shorter work week, police officers who could work a shorter work week. And so when I asked, like, well, what's this? How do you do this? I ended up kind of describing it as sort of like almost like the success sequence. And it's the same thing that a lot of the successful work redesigns did, which is they kind of just had to, so much when I talk to people, it's like when you ask them, why do you do things the way that you do them? They're like, well, I don't know. We just always have. This is the way we do it. So there's no thought. There's just a lot of like spinning forward and then adding more and more without really thinking about what you're doing. And in each of these instances, they kind of stopped and they kind of took a breath and had to really think, okay, what is the work that we do? What is the value we create? What's the outcome we're after? Not just the input of long hours. What are we trying to produce or the outcome we want? And then how do we ladder up all of the systems, the meetings, the time, the schedule, people's workloads? How do we really focus on that outcome and make everything kind of ladder up to that? Once we have the outcome set, do we all need to be in the same place for the same number of hours? Yeah, no. If this is the outcome, and every place was different. They all had a different answer depending upon what their work was, what the value that they were working toward creating. I talked to this one travel agency, and they were able to use technology in a very smart way. And it did free up people's time, using AI and like automation for, inputting data and reservations. But what he didn't end up cutting people or laying people off. That freed up those agents then to do more research, to come up with like cooler, adventures, to plan, cooler trips and do more marketing and sales. So in the time that I spoke with them, his company had tripled in size and they were working shorter hours using technology more effectively and people were really happy. It's like, there are, people call them win-win-win situations, and there are a lot of them out there. And in the United States, like looking at some of the, again, going back to some of the health workers, really seeing a big difference when you have adequate staffing, when you have, the scheduling is not like out of control. Some of the gap study that I mentioned with bringing more, stability to retail workers. I spoke with workers in Oregon. Oregon is the first state in the United States that passed a statewide predictable scheduling law. And you talk to people there, businesses are happier, there's less turnover, so there's more stability. They don't have to spend a whole lot of time recruiting, hiring, onboarding, training, and then losing people and kind of in that cycle over and over again. And people have more time for their lives. There's one family that I spoke to, it's a single mom. Her sister was a single mom, and their schedules were all over the place. They both worked in retail, and they couldn't find childcare. Their hours were unpredictable, so that their income could swing as much as 30%, even though your bills don't. So they couldn't really afford full-time childcare because they didn't know if they would get full-time hours. So their mom had to stop working to take care of their kids, which kind of kept the family trapped in poverty. And so once the schedules were stabilized, each of the daughters were able to find childcare that fit with their schedules. The mom was able to go back to work, and the family was able to rise, pay their bills, have a sense of ease and peace of mind. The woman that I spoke with even was taking a training and getting more education. Those are the outcomes we all say we want. It's happening. It's already happening, which is really cool. We just need to pay more attention to it and do more of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess it also comes back to what you were saying at the beginning of this conversation, that it comes down to also leadership and the leaders that really buy into this and want to try something new, like the travel agency that you mentioned. When it comes down to workers themselves, can you talk to us a little bit about the power of community in addressing it and community groups in addressing these issues? Because that's one of the things we're trying to do at WorkVue and kind of empower and enable more community to address overwork and other work related issues.
Yeah, it's so important. Again, when I was looking at successful movements for change, it's bottom up, it's middle out, sometimes it's top down. But to get to top down, you need the pressure coming from the bottom up or the middle out, or even the middle in. And that's people coming together and sharing their stories. That's people coming together, sharing best practices and ideas. That's people coming together and really supporting one another. I have a chapter in the book on Workaholics Anonymous, and just watching the power of peer support was really powerful there. And there's a lot of research that backs that up. When people don't feel so alone, when they feel like their problems, or their challenges are not just because of them or because of a personal failing, and they're part of a community where they can begin to see the bigger picture, see the water that we're swimming in, and then work together. Well, how are you navigating that? It's like, okay, so we don't have any paid maternity leave or paid family leave in the United States. Okay, what are you doing? How are you navigating that? Personally in your own experience, and then are you working towards something so that we can change that for the better for everybody? Like if you need to take care of yourself. I mean, a lot of times people, you think of paid family leave and people automatically think of maternity leave. But if you look at the data from like the Unpaid Family Medical Leave Act, the majority of people take leave to take care of themselves. I mean, we're human, we're not robots. So, we talk about the importance of care for one, we're families of one, many of us. And that's really important to remember.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess, I mean, there's one quote from your book that is not yours, but I've I've quoted a lot of yours as well that I really enjoyed, and I think it's great to leave. I'd like to read it, so we leave the conversation on that note. Is hope is like a path in the countryside. First, there's nothing, but as people walk this way again and again, a path appears. So I think that was kind of to me that stayed as a community thing. And it's a quote by Luke Sun. And yeah, it really resonated. I'd like to open it up now for questions from the audience. We've had a few comments and questions already. So if I can look through some of these, one of the comments is What if I'm child free, not active within the community, don't aren't more productive working from home, but still feel overwhelmed?
Yeah, I hear you. You know, if it's, again, it goes back to culture. Are you in a culture that expects and demands a lot? Are you in a culture where it's seen as sort of a failure? If you tell your boss, it's like, well, my plate's really full, that's really not realistic to ask me to do that. And it's instead like, yes, I'll do it. Those are really difficult cultures to manage overwhelm in. So that's one thing. Um, you know, Keeping in mind the culture, and this is where the peer community comes in. That's so important. But the other thing too, like with work from home, I think it's a skill that you need to develop. Working flexibly is a skill. It's not something that we just know how to do. And so I think that we need to give ourselves grace to figure out, well, what works for me. Um, there's a wonderful book, Ellen Ernst Kosik has written it. It's called The CEO of Me. And sometimes you have to really understand, are you somebody who really likes to separate work and life? Some people, she calls them separators. Some people are segmenters, kind of like you do a little bit and you switch and a little bit and you switch. And then some people are fusion lovers. You're kind of like you do everything all at once all the time, and your work and your life are all sort of smushed together. What works for you, and maybe it's going to be different at different periods of your life, but the first thing is to kind of understand your own work style. What works for you? Are you a morning person? Are you a late night person? What do you want your work style to be? How will that mesh with what you're expected to do? Do you have clarity about what you're expected to do? Do you have good communication with whoever you're working with? Because a lot of times people have a really difficult time sort of tooting their own horn and letting people know, I did this, I'm amazing. But particularly for women, particularly in a digital situation, you have to communicate your value. Because when you have a workplace that, again, looks at long hours, if you are not physically present in the office with that jacket, and let me tell you, there's research that shows that men with the jacket and the empty office, there's people think, oh, they're out at a client. If it's a woman with an empty jacket, they're like, oh, she's shirking. She's with her kids, or she's gone to a yoga class or something like that. So that can really hurt you. Again, sort of like the power of the narrative and the story. So you've got to be able to clearly communicate your value. And then finally, for yourself, I mean, it's something that I constantly have had to, keep an eye on. You create boundaries or rituals. It is so easy if you're working at home and your office is your kitchen table or your home office or your bed, that work could just spill over into everything. Now, if you're a fusion lover, that's fine, as long as you make sure there's time and space for other parts of your life that you value. Whether that's going for a walk or taking care of yourself or just, doing something fun and silly, or, if you want to go have lunch with your friends, that's valuable. You got to make time for that. So figure out what those rituals are. For me, honestly, this is my home office. I've written two books here. I love working here. I worry now that I've become a little bit too much of a COVID hermit. So I'm now trying to push myself out on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, get out and go meet with people. I mean, when I'm out on story, I love doing that. I love being out reporting. But when I'm working in my home office, my ritual is I come in the morning, I turn on my lights, then I'm working. And then at the end of the day, I turn them off, which helps me not come back in here because there's always more to do.
Mm.
And I think that's one of the things that's hard. It's hard to know when you're done, especially for a lot of our modern jobs. And they're complicated. There's work conflict. So it's hard to know, have I done enough? Is it good enough? And that's where some of that internal work and communicating with your team really matters so that you can figure out, what is your one thing? Did you do it? Is it enough? Time to unplug.
Yeah, and going back to the thing you just said about the working style and finding out what your working style is, we don't do enough talking to young people in high school or at university level even about what kind of work style comes with different occupations and jobs. I've spoken to a group of media graduates recently, and they were absolutely shocked at the kind of the way they expected to do work, which is very much project based, which is very much requiring them to travel and be in different places at short notice. And that is not something that they realized when they decided that that's what they want to do. So
Mhm.
there's not enough conversation happening about what that working style is like so that people can decide if that works for them or not, but also so that we can all challenge it together and say, is that really what it has to be? Um,
Yeah.
we have another question. How do you deal with people who take too much pride in overworking themselves?
Mm. Oh my goodness, that's such an important question. And it's honestly, it's one that I have had to confront myself. I spent most of my career in newspaper newsrooms, super macho, long work hours, people bragging about being there late. And if it's not physical presence, then it's digital presence, sending emails really late at night. And listen, I got totally caught up in it too. I think it was one of the reasons I felt so guilty and filled with shame when I had little kids. We had a Metro editor once who would send out these like little missives of, who the great workers were and great stories that they did. And I just remember they were always like, and so, she hasn't had a weekend off in, 6 months. Ah, like that was the way we were supposed to work. So it can be really difficult. And I remember I was talking to Peter Senge about it who's written things like The Fifth Discipline. And he really gave me a good perspective. And he said, if you're in these kinds of macho ideal worker cultures, these overwork cultures, and that is sort of the way that the leaders feel comfortable, and God knows they're not working that way. When you look at who works flexibly, CEOs work the most flexibly of all, and there's stories of like people signing return to office memos in the middle of COVID when, they were in their villa in Italy. You know what I mean? So there is a lot of hypocrisy, and the Slack Futures Forum would do these wonderful pulse surveys that just showed that so clearly. So a lot of people are not walking the talk at the top, but it's sort of like a control thing. Um, and I'm kind of trying to. I'm sorry. I'm like all of these. This is such an important question. Like how do you fight this overwork culture? So some of the things that I have seen people do really effectively, it's called sort of sludge, like, oh, must be nice, you're leaving early, is to turn to the person and just say, is there something you need? Is there something you need right now? And then and turning it back again to like performance and outcome, and is there something urgent? And oftentimes, um, you know, instead of valorizing, like, oh, you stayed up really late last night, you must be an amazing worker, starting to shift the conversations like, oh, wow, I'm so sorry you're so inefficient. Why did that take so long? Are there systems that we need to change? So kind of really trying to get underneath and ask questions about what drives it. So rather than, kind of jumping on board and being part of the busyness train, again, this is where being focused on your own outcomes, being focused on your own, the value that you bring, and being able to communicate that clearly is so important. Because what Peter Senge was saying is that in those overwork cultures, if you try to work differently, you can be seen as very threatening. It's kind of like an identity threat. So recognize that, but recognize also you don't have to buy into it. And the best way in a business culture is to really show the value that you bring. Um, and you don't have to hide, but what I would say to leaders, what they need to do is uncover more. Because there's a lot of times people think that they're working all hours and they don't know that they've had like 3 hours off to go walk the dog. And so people need to, leaders in particular, I encourage them to uncover and to share a lot of that. Like for me, I try not to send late night emails, but if I do, it's mainly because I have an idea and I want to get it out of my head. And so you can schedule that to go out on regular time, or we use Slack, and I don't expect people to read it. And I'll be like, for Monday, I just had to get this out of my head. So think about ways that you can also disrupt that overwork culture, particularly if you're in a role of authority over other people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I see Carla has put a message about scheduling emails so that they come at a different time. Thank you so much, Brigid, for your invaluable time. It's been very interesting for us, and I'm sure for the audience. Your book is amazing. I look forward to reading more stories emerging from you in the coming years. And thank you for spending your hour with us.
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to put my email in the chat. If you guys have stories of hope, if you want to share something, hit me up because I'm constantly looking for stories to write. So, I'd be happy to hear from any of you.
That's great. Thank you very much, and thanks everyone for joining us today.
All right. Thanks so
Thank
much.
you. Thanks. Bye.